Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today is Zander Keig. Zander Keig is a licensed clinical social worker, the owner of Keig Consulting, and the author of a new book called The Third Space, a nonconformist guide to the universe. You can find out more about Zander Keig and his wonderful work at his website, zanderkeig.net. Welcome, Zander Keig.
Hi, Catherine. It's great to be here.
It's so wonderful to have you on our show. And for our audience, excuse the beeping, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. You are also a wonderful host here at UK Health Radio. Will you share with everyone about your radio show?
Absolutely. So, I am the co-host of the podcast, The Umbrella Hour. My co-host is Dr. An Goldbauer. We focus on interviewing members of the LGBT community to talk to them about their lives and what they're up to and what's happening, what they're doing. And we have a variety of perspectives and viewpoints on our show. We want to showcase the great diversity that exists within the LGBT community.
Fantastic. And will you share with everyone where people can learn more about your radio show? Where can they go to listen?
Absolutely. Well, we're definitely one of the shows available on the UK Health Radio Network website. I started a Substack page, which is theumbrella.hour.substack.com. And if you go to my website, Zander Keig, that's KEIG.net, I also have a link to the podcast there.
Fantastic. Now, Zander Keig, you wrote a book, The Third Space, a nonconformist guide to the universe. And as the author of 10 books myself, I know that writing even one book is a huge accomplishment. Congratulations.
Thank
Why did
you.
you write that book? Because I know for myself, as an author, I'll have an idea, but then it takes a lot of passion to write a book. Why did you write that book?
Well, to be honest, people have been telling me for about 25 years now, you should write a book because people think I have a fascinating life or I've had fascinating experiences. And people will often tell me every time I sit down and talk with you, I learn something new about you. And I'm thinking, well, isn't that true for everybody? But maybe not. But something about my life was considered fascinating to a lot of people. But I wasn't that curious or about writing a book. I do have experience with editing anthologies, and I have contributed chapters and an introduction to other people's books. But writing my own book, solo book, took a little bit of cajoling. Maybe the last 5 years, I started to consider, sure, I'll write a book. Well, what am I going to write a book about? Because other people might be fascinated by my life and my stories, but I'm not so fascinated by them. They've happened to me. So I started to think about what would I write about and how would I communicate what I wanted to communicate to people. And so over the last 4 years, I've been conducting organizational well-being workshops where I've been teaching people how to just do how to tolerate distress, how to regulate emotions, how to mitigate conflict. And people have been interested in more on those topics. And so I thought maybe what I could do is I can combine the work that I do with the life I've lived, so then I can demonstrate through my stories how I've been able to acquire a skill set of emotion regulation, distress tolerance, conflict mitigation, and I've applied it to my own life, which the first 20 years of my life were quite challenging. Um, and so, like, how did I make it through? Right? I've had more than one person say to me, "How is it that you're alive today?" And I had to think about it like, well, I mean, I'm just alive. What do you mean how? But I as a licensed clinical social worker, now I've heard stories from individuals about the trials and tribulations of their life. And some of them have succumbed deeply to the challenges in their life, or as we would say clinically, the traumas in their life, and what makes them different from me. Why haven't I succumbed to the depths of depression or to the highs of anxiety, or like, why not? And so I started to think about that, and I thought maybe that'll be an interesting book to write. So that's what I did. And so this idea of the third space, people might be familiar with the concept of the middle path in Buddhism, or endow the path, right? Even from literature, the path least taken. And so the third space is my way of communicating that idea that I tend to travel in the third spaces, and I use examples of the kinds of positive and negative attention that that garners, and how I've used this skill set that I have to mitigate those challenges.
So Zander Keig, what is your definition of the third space? What is the third space?
Well, let me give you some examples. So I can remember as a maybe a late teen, early 20 something year old. And I would go to workshops. My father was really big into these human potential workshops. You might be familiar with one of them that I went through as a child called EST, right? And so in some of these workshops, they tend to break the room up into males and females, men and women, go on different sides of the room or into two different rooms. And I remember even back then being quite aware of the fact that I'm a trans man, so my sex is female. So I spent the first 36 or 39 years of my life presenting to the world as a woman, albeit a very masculine one. And so I remember in my late teens, early 20s, when they would say, okay, we're going to split the room into, men and women, I would walk into the middle of the room and I would say, I'm going to stay here in the middle of the room. And if you'd like to join me, then join me and we will go through these exercises as this third option in the room. So that's like one example. When people say to me, because it's politics or the big topic all of a sudden, the last several years, last decade, basically, in my sphere at least. And so people would say, oh, are you a Democrat or a Republican? And I'm an independent, right? So it's like this assertion of being in the middle. I just refer to it as the third space.
Great explanation. Now, Zander Keig, your book is called The Third Space, a Nonconformist Guide to the Universe.
Yeah.
I love that. It's a beautiful title. What is your definition of a nonconformist? What is a nonconformist?
Yeah, so for me, being a nonconformist, that started much younger in my life. I was a tomboy, which wasn't unusual in the 70s, but it was unusual in my Mexican Catholic family, in Southern California. I'm first generation born in this country, so my family's very traditional, Mexican Catholic, and so this tomboyishness of mine was gender nonconforming, right? And then I was very much involved in activist, like political activism, in my, like, again, late teens, early 20s. And that was, and in a way, I was an activist within the gay and lesbian community. And so I was non-conforming in sort of a cultural or social way, because back then, and this was be in the early 80s, we didn't have gay marriage and we didn't have the right to adoption and we didn't have the right to serve in the military. So I was very much against the grain, so to speak, right? Nonconformist in that way. Um, my father was a Marine. My uncle Edward was a Marine. My other three uncles were all soldiers in the Army. I went into the Coast Guard, which was not Department of Defense, but Department of Transportation, then now Homeland Security. So it's like, in a way, I became a service member, but I did it in a completely different way from, what most people expect. A lot of people have never even heard of the Coast Guard, and when they have, they don't realize it's a military service. So it's like a type of like military nonconformity. I was a conscientious objector in the Coast Guard, which again is not common. It's non-conforming to what people assume somebody who's serving in the military holds, values, what their morals are. So it's, yeah, so those are just a few early examples. I mean, I could go on and on, but it gives you an idea of.
So Zander Keig, you are a trans person.
Yeah.
And for many of us, I'm 65 and I absolutely grew up with gay and lesbian neighbors. Okay. And for many of us, the idea of a trans person is a new concept for us. How can we speak? Please give us advice. How can we speak kindly and compassionately with a trans person?
Mm. Well, I'll let you know right off the bat that as a community of trans people, we're not a monolith. So, what I can tell you today is that the language is ever changing. And what that means is that even somebody like me is not completely up to date on language, because not only does it change constantly, it differs or it varies based on where you are within our country, the United States, other countries, other cultures, different, demographic groups, like different age groups. And so there's a lot of differences. But in general, like for example, I say I'm a trans man, you said trans person. That to me is a nice neutral way of talking about trans people or to a trans person from my perspective. Some people might not like that, but the only way to know whether they like it or not is to either say it and then hear from them, or some people have the energy and the interest in front loading how they talk about or to trans people by asking questions like, is there a certain set of pronouns that you ask people to use when speaking about you? If you know somebody in your life who's trans and you've always known them with a specific name, you can say, is there a different name that you're using now? And so, again, for the most part, most trans people are friendly and reasonable and are not going to be bothered by those kinds of questions. But I would warn people that you can, from time to time, encounter a more kind of hostile or belligerent kind of trans person that responds in a way that can shock you, even when you're doing your best. It'll never be good enough for some people. It's a small group of people, but just, I like to let people know that there's no need to walk on eggshells around us. We are reasonable, well-adjusted people, but that's not always going to be the case. So just be alert to that.
So basically, what you're saying is we need to ask the individual how they want to be referred to.
You can. I mean, it all depends. So, for example, when people meet me and they see me and they hear me and they say, what pronouns would you like me to use? It irks me a little because, well, how do I look and sound? Right. But where this is interesting is that where other people might still decide I'm going to ask that question is because they could actually meet a trans person who looks and sounds just like me and wants a completely different set of pronouns used. Maybe they, them versus he, him, or even maybe she, her. There are people who are making no outward effort to change their physical appearance. They're just saying I'm trans, right? They identify, they feel themselves to be trans. They're using that language, but they're not doing like something like what I've done as a transsexual, which is take hormones and change my name legally and change the sex marker on all my government identification legally, right? They're not necessarily going to do that. There's more of a feeling of I shouldn't have to. And so if you saw a person that looked and sounded like me and you said, you use a male pronoun, they could possibly get upset about that. Most people will just correct you and in a nice, gentle way.
I admit I'm an author. I'm the author of 10 books myself. And where I really get confused is when trans people use they,
Mhm.
because they and them to me means plural. It means more
Yeah.
than one.
Yes.
As
Yeah,
opposed
that's
to,
fairly common. That's
yeah.
fairly common because yes, it is a plural. We use it singularly when we're talking about somebody and we don't know what sex they are or we don't know what gender they are. So we'll say, "Oh, they work as a doctor," or are they a doctor, right? Something like that. So we do use it in that sense. I have heard people say that it has been used in literature going back, many, many years, like not just 10 or 20, but, 100 or more years, maybe even hundreds of years, where that was used, but it was very infrequent. So it is, I think your reaction or your response is much more common. And so it's a challenge then for people to make the change in their mind, right? Because again, when you look at me and you hear me, your mind already makes up assumptions about me, and it puts me into the category of male, of which I'm not. I am female, but I present to the world as a man, and I live in the world socially as a man. So using he, him pronouns just makes sense, especially if you're talking about me to somebody else. You could use she, her. They're not technically incorrect, but it would be confusing to other people because then they'd be like, well, I went and listened to the podcast or I saw the video and who were you talking about? Right. So that's where it gets confusing. But it does make sense to me that people would struggle to learn a new set of pronouns and to use them in a way that is counterintuitive to their own understanding of language. Yeah.
Now, here at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio, I've recorded a number of interviews about the scientific fact that people of color experience a tremendous amount of prejudice. That's not new news, but how all the prejudice affects their mental and physical health. So we know scientifically that prejudice affects um, their mental and physical health as well as their financial well being. What sort of prejudices do trans people commonly face?
Mm. Well, minority stress definitely impacts the trans community to varying degrees. It all has to do with, there's so many factors, right? So, are you, as a trans person, are you or aren't you accepted by your immediate family, right? That's a good baseline because the more acceptance you have in the family, and it doesn't need to be, what's good about research is, the Family Acceptance Project has shown that it doesn't have to be 100% acceptance by family in order for the children, the LGBT or trans children in particular, to be able to grow up into productive, healthy, adults. It has to be enough so that there is a sense of dignity and worth and purpose, right? The self-esteem isn't damaged. So it doesn't have to be a lot. We don't, I didn't have parents that walked in gay pride with, with the parents and friends of lesbians and gays or P flag group, right? I didn't need that. But I had enough. I had enough support. And so at that level, I didn't face a lot of prejudice. But then it's like in the schools, there's, bullying that happens. There's harassment. There's the people in leadership, right? Teachers, administrators who ignore the bullying or dismiss the bullying, or get in on the bullying, right? That's known to happen. There's some research from the oh, what's that organization called? It's GLSEN. It used to be Gays and Lesbians in Education, but it stands for something else, but it's GLSEN.org, I believe. And they do a lot of research on people in middle school, high school level. And the research shows that kids are feeling like they're getting bullied, not just by their peers, but also by teachers and administrators. And then there's for trans people in particular, when we go into the healthcare settings and we might experience it would be normal it is normal to have a medical provider, healthcare provider, who doesn't know about trans people, doesn't understand trans people, so might not use all the right words. And I'm okay with that. Again, some people might not be okay with that. But when you come across a medical provider who has prejudice and then refuses to see you or refuses to refer you to another specialist or cancels appointments with you, I've had some pretty bad experiences in medical settings. Um, for that reason, because of a prejudice. And then there's just out in society, right? There's walking in the streets. So prior to doing my medical transition, meaning prior to doing hormones, cross-sex hormones, or some people call it gender affirming hormones, I was a very masculine woman. So when I was out on the streets, I was pretty clearly clocked as a masculine woman, a lesbian, right? And so that brought me a lot of grief. People who didn't like that, who didn't like gayness or didn't like masculine women or whatever it was. And so I would be assaulted verbally. I'd get a lot of verbal harassment. When I was younger, I'd get a lot of sort of physical threats, or I was even in a few fights with like older men who wanted to like physically push me around. That hasn't happened since I, started the medical transition. People leave me alone now. So there's like all these different ways in which the prejudice and the harassment and the bigotry, discrimination can come up. And I just mentioned a few. There's many other places. And so where it ends up happening is that some people who have more of a external locus of control are going to internalize those negative messages and those negative experiences, and then end up doing things like perhaps self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, or sex or shopping or video gaming or pornography, watching porn, all the different ways that people try to self-soothe or self-calm through those means. But it might also lead to um, people experiencing higher than just sort of normal levels of anxiety, leading to a generalized anxiety disorder, or higher than normal kind of feelings of sadness that you might have in your life from time to time and have major depressive disorder. And so, there's a lot of things that could be showing up for people. But I'd say the drug and alcohol, use and abuse, and in some cases addiction, can happen, right? So for a person like me, I am an internal locus of control person. I did not and I do not internalize those negative messages. I'm quite antagonistic towards them, actually. I think that's part of my nonconformity as well. And taking that middle path or third space, option, is that I just don't give much of a hoot what other people think about me. And for me, that's been a protective factor.
That's
But
a
not everybody has those protective factors.
Yeah, so whether we're a trans individual or not, what you think of me is none of my business.
I
That's
love that. Yes,
good psychological health. What you think
absolutely.
of me is none of my business.
That's right.
Because again, no matter what our sexual orientation, we have to recognize it's a spiritual truth that other people, they have a right to their own thoughts and feelings. They
Yes.
have their own history and their own programming and their own worldview. And
Yes.
so as a spiritual principle, when you allow other people to be who you are, who they are, and then you give yourself permission to be who you are, then we can all have greater peace. And
Yes. Now, of course, it would be nice if the way people felt stayed in their heads. But when it passes from thought into action, and they decide that they have the right to come into somebody else's personal space and call them a derogatory name, or try and get them removed from a place of worship or a job or a hotel or a neighborhood, that's when it starts to impede on other people's life and liberty, right, as we're guaranteed. So that's when it goes from like prejudice into discrimination, right? And even so, if people come up to me, which they don't, because mostly I'm at home nowadays, but when people used to come up to me and have derogatory statements, and would, mostly religiously oriented, prejudicial statements, Back then, I wasn't I wasn't as strong in my ability to withstand. So it over a period of time, it did grate on me, sort of like the concept of the, 10,000 lashes, right? It was like, or we might refer to them now as microaggressions, right? It's like over a period of like what 20 years of my life, it started to take its toll. And then with transition, I was able to reset, and all of those microaggressions from the past are in the past, and now I'm starting from scratch. And so my hope is, and I'm much more resilient now, that in the next 25 to 30 years, I will not end up in the same place where I feel beaten down by those experiences.
And
I
with
think I'll
that,
be fine.
and with that, we'll take a break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. You're listening to Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, and Zander Keig, licensed clinical social worker and author of The Third Space, a nonconformist guide to the universe. Zander Keig. Here we are at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. And one of the things that we know scientifically is that prejudice, whether it's against people of color or people with different sexual orientations, affects people on every level, mentally, physically, financially, their overall well-being. How can we show greater compassion for trans individuals?
Well, we can start by seeking out opportunities to engage with trans people. And if meeting with trans people directly seems a bit too much of a first step to take, people can read books that are written by trans people. There are thousands of books that have been published written by trans people from all over the world. So they can, do a quick internet search. They can, on books written by trans women, trans men, trans people. They could go to Goodreads, and people have put together lists on Goodreads. They could go to my website and see the books that I have edited, the anthologies, and learn about a bunch of different kinds of trans men's experiences. There's also documentaries that have been made, feature-length films. So people can learn about us in those ways, books, films. And then there are live opportunities. So going to a panel speaking, event, or going to a theater event where there might be a theme, a trans theme in a theater production, or a choir, a concert. There are trans people who sing in different choirs or choruses, and I don't know if it still exists, but when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a transgender gospel choir that even cut an album or two and was traveling around the world singing. So it's like you go to an event where the people engaged in the event are trans or predominantly trans. And so that's a way for people who are more academic oriented. There's probably a few dozen conferences that happen around the United States in particular that are focused on trans people, either our health or legal issues or our community. And so people can attend conferences and learn that way. And then there's also another way is people can join something like the Human Library, where they can do a 15 to 20-minute one-on-one, where they check out a human book, where the title of the book is something like transgender or transsexual or non-binary. And so you check out a book and it's a person, right? So it's called the Human Library. It's a wonderful organization. I'm one of the books, right, that people could check out. My book title is Transsexual. I have several book titles, but that's the one that's pertinent to this topic.
So,
Um,
so Zander Keig, what exactly is the Human Library?
So the human library is, I don't know, I can't, I don't have it right in front of me to read off how they describe themselves, but how I would describe them is that it's an organization that was founded to provide opportunities for people to learn about other people in their communities. And so, you know, the book titles can range from anything like bipolar to Vietnam veteran, transsexual, um, parent of a autistic kid, right? Jewish, Muslim, atheist. And so a person is like, I don't know anything about that topic, or I don't think I've ever met anybody who is part of that community. So you check out a book, and what you do is you just ask questions, and the books or the people, right? The people who are the books are trained in answering honestly, but not antagonistically, not defensively, right? To be an open book. And so if somebody asks me a question that I don't want to answer, I can respond with something like, that chapter hasn't been written yet. Do you have any other questions for me?
So, what kind of questions have you been asked about what it's like to be a transsexual?
Hmm. Mostly it has to do with things like, um, did I have any knowledge of that I was trans when I was a child? Um, and I say to them, well, no, because I'm almost 60 years old and I had no understanding of that. It's much more in the culture now. So, younger people do have more access to information and are using that as a like an identity or as a label for themselves. Also, a lot of questions around how has my family been? Has my family been supportive or not? And my Mexican Catholic family has been nothing but wonderful since day one. I'm very fortunate. I have a great family. I mentioned, when the interaction first starts, the human book gives a description, right? A little synopsis of what their book entails. And so in that description, I mentioned a few things, and one of them is that I've been married for 22 years. And so when people ask me, well, how long have you been medically transitioned? Meaning, how long have I been on hormones? And I say, for example, now I would say, oh, 19 years. And they'd say, oh, but you've been married for 22 years. So you were married before. And I say, yes. And then they say, oh, well, what kind of person are you married to? And I say, I'm married to a woman. And they say, how is she been? What's her response been? Right? Which is wonderful. My wife Margaret is the best person I've ever known. She's wonderful. So everything has been great for 22 years. So it's like questions like that, mostly very personal questions. I don't have too many unwritten chapters, so I've answered every question that's ever been asked of me.
That's fantastic. And with that, let's take another break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. We're here listening to Zander Keig, licensed clinical social worker and author of The Third Space, a nonconformist guide to the universe. We'll be right back. Zander Keig, I have to share with our audience about my experience as a medical intuitive healer. So, as of this recording, I'm 65 years old. I've been in natural healing for 31 years. So, over the years, I've worked with clients of all kinds of sexual orientations. And what's interesting to me is that what I found, because as you talked about being in the human library and people asking you questions, and what I have found is that many people with issues about their sexual orientation, it actually goes back to being a birth issue. So, what do I mean by that? So, the circumstances of your birth affect you your whole life. And often, subconsciously, the parents wanted a boy or they wanted a girl, and so the individual grows up with a feeling like I'm not the right sex, right? And so it can happen that way where people are
Mm.
really questioning their sexuality. In addition to that, I can remember years ago working with a lady, and she said that every night as a little girl, she would go to bed praying that she would wake up as a boy. And it was just heartbreaking, right? To think that, this individual who at the time that I worked with her was probably in her 40s or 50s, I don't really recall, had literally spent decades wishing she was another sex. And so we have to have a lot of compassion for individuals who are just different from us. So if there was one thing, Xander Keg, that you wished that other people had more compassionate about for transsexuals, what would that be? How can we have greater compassion for the trans community?
Well, I think it's as simple as accepting the reality that there is variation in human beings, just like there is in animals and plants, right? There's variation, and that the beauty exists in that diversity, right? If roses were only red, they probably wouldn't be as special. But the fact is that there are so many different colors of roses, and you can cultivate new types of roses by blending them together, right? There's so many kinds of birds, and there's so many kinds of trees, and there's so many kinds of animals. There's so many kinds of people. And so I think that the natural diversity, this variance within the human species is to be celebrated. That doesn't mean that, everybody needs to attend like a gay pride parade. I don't mean celebrate like it's a birthday party. I mean, just acknowledge it and incorporate it in. Now, there will always be people who are like, no, I'm not going to do that. And that is their right too. They do not have to celebrate, they don't have to tolerate, they don't have to accept, and they don't have to welcome trans people into their community. That is the minority of people. And so even those individuals, they're human beings too, and they deserve the right to be treated as human beings. So it's all about not dehumanizing people. So I don't want to be dehumanized, and I'm not going to dehumanize other people just because they don't agree with me or like me or think that I should be able to do what I've done, which is take hormones and change my legal, my go through the court system to change my name and the sex that's on my documents. I understand that not everybody agrees with that. I wanted to make a comment about what you were saying about going back to childbirth, or because so you mentioned you said sexual orientation. I think there's a difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. I think sexual orientation comes into play a little bit later, like when we're in puberty, right? Adolescence. But the interesting thing I think about, you know, amongst pediatricians, they say, right, developmentally, that we know that we're a boy or a girl by the time we're 5 years old.
Hmm?
And you were saying that there's the truism of some parents wished for the sex of a child other than what they ended up with, and therefore they might be forming the idea that that child has about their sex based on Right? I've heard the stories of little boys being constantly put in dresses by a parent or a grandparent and letting their hair grow out and telling everybody they're a girl. Like this actually does exist. I think there's also another type of example, which is when you grow up in a culture that says boys do this and girls do this. So if you're a girl like I was, or basically still am, but not really, right? Is There were certain things that I wasn't supposed to do. So teachers would say, no, only boys do that. Or people in my family might say, only boys do that. Or the toy store said, only boys get to play with those toys. And so there could also be the reality that you have young children who are like, well, if only boys can play with those toys, then I want to be a boy. And then they start taking on the behaviors, the mannerisms, the style. They want to wear the clothes of the boys, so then they can play with boys' toys. And so, I hear from people, like especially gay and lesbian people, who say that they were very gender nonconforming as children. They wanted to do the things that their family or their school or their society or their place of worship said, you can't do that. That's not for you. That's for children that are not like you. And so I think that that does contribute to some of that gender nonconformity. Now, how specifically it may relate to those of us who grow up to be trans, I mean, that's a really interesting discussion to have. Unfortunately, there's not enough research that's done on trans people in general, not even around our medical transitions, which there should be a lot more of that. So it's, psychology, sociology, medicine. These are a lot of different, disciplines that have done their studies, but it's, I think, there's no definitive answer, and maybe that's okay too, because maybe it's an amalgamation of multiple things. Maybe for some people, one occurrence is more influential than the other, right? It's like if somebody asks me, like, why are you trans? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. It's just that this is the life I live. I prefer it to the life I had before. It was available to me, and so I proceeded along. I was so masculine as a woman that it was much easier to just to continue down the masculine path and change how I sound and look and how I am treated in the world than it would be to withstand the barrage of sort of hateful looks and words from people who don't like masculine women in society, versus going and trying to be more feminine. Like that was not going to work. It wasn't going to happen for me. Right. So it's like I basically had those three options, I thought. So I'm like, well, let me just try this option where I go more into the masculine. And it's been a wonderful experience for me.
So as you know, Zander Keig, the end result of contempt and prejudice against gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals, especially our youth, is that many of them get turned out of their houses and end up homeless.
Yeah.
So there's a real problem with prejudice. How can we combat religious prejudice?
Oh boy. Well, I'd say make sure you attend a place of worship that doesn't have that prejudice embedded into it. For some people, that might mean just finding a different temple or congregation. For other people, it might mean they have to leave their particular religion and maybe go to another one. So it all depends, right? It depends on the religion. It depends a lot on the culture, where you are in the world. So I mean, that's a good start. I don't think that the answer is always to abandon religion. I think faith is an important part. I have a master's in theology. Like, I think faith is an important component of life. I think research does show that, having a faith system and a family system that is supportive in your life is better for your well-being than not having those things. So that's what I would say. You know, the other is people are allowed to have religious beliefs and feelings that I would define as prejudicial or discriminatory, as long as they're not trying to impact my life um, in a way like putting laws in the books or making it so that I can't keep or get a job, that I can't buy a house, or I can't eat in a restaurant, right? Or I can't get married to my partner, right? And so we used to deal with those things, right? We used to deal with the fact that gay and lesbian people could not get married to their partners. We had where, you know, same-sex couples couldn't adopt children. We couldn't serve in the military openly. But over the course of a few decades, working on those issues, you know, those laws changed. And so I'd say just work to change the laws, um, find a supportive, welcoming, you know, religious community, if you want to belong to, and just make sure that in the gentlest way, I really think that you know, dealing with prejudice, responding to prejudice with prejudice doesn't work,
I
right?
I
And
think that is the quote of the interview. Responding to prejudice with prejudice doesn't work.
it
Amen.
doesn't, right? And so I know a lot of people, right? I have a lot of friends, and you know, there are some of them who respond to prejudice with prejudice, and it is an infuriating path to take because it doesn't work, and you just walk away from these interactions frustrated, angry, filled with rage. You want to retaliate. And so that's what we see. I'm not on social media, but I know what's happening on social media. That's what social media is to me. It's a lot of prejudice responding to prejudice, and people saying awful things. And so I'm like, listen, no matter what a person says to me, I have the wherewithal, I have the ability. And if I didn't, it's incumbent on me to get it. I need to acquire, and I have acquired a skill set that lets me respond to bigotry with grace, with kindness, with curiosity. I might not like what that person is saying at all.
Zander Keig, you have shared with us so much about how we can show greater compassion to the trans community. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 bestselling author. Our guest today has been the one and only Zander Keig, licensed clinical social worker. You can read his wonderful book, The Third Space, A Nonconformist Guide to the Universe, and find out about his wonderful work at zanderkeig.net. Remember, the most powerful healing force in the universe is love. And as we learn to cultivate compassion for ourselves, as well as people who are different from us, everyone heals naturally. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.